Imagine going into a restaurant where every menu is in a foreign language and you get a negative response when asking for help from a local. When visiting a foreign country with limited knowledge on their language and culture, you're very likely to experience culture shock, and locals aren't always willing to help. I've been learning all about communication this semester in my Com 101 class at JJC. I have read the text and applied what I learned to the speeches I developed this semester, including this one. Today, I would like to share what I learned about the effects on communication from culture shock. I will begin my speech by giving you an overview of what culture shock is and how people respond to it in my experiences. Then I will go on to tell you about a positive experience I had when I started to overcome culture shock. And finally, I will suggest ways to get over culture shock yourself. First, let me explain what culture shock is. Culture shock is defined by the stressful transitional period when individuals move from a familiar environment into an unfamiliar one. Every interaction moment when experiencing culture shock could create unintentional awkwardness or stress. When a person is experiencing culture shock, it is very common for them to experience anxiety, feelings of helplessness, and sometimes depression. The feelings come from being unfamiliar with your surroundings, and this can include an unfamiliarity with language, social and conversational cues, climate, religion, and food. When exploring a new culture, people often communicate differently in many ways, with the way they resolve conflicts and express their feelings and emotions, body language, face, and body movements. These differences can put an extreme damper on communication. Based on my experiences with culture shock in France, locals don't necessarily respond the best, and they're often rude when you don't immerse yourself completely into their culture and language. After hearing about what culture shock is, let's move on to an experience I had when having to cope with culture shock in France. The event I'm about to describe occurred towards the end of a trip with my class that my friend and I attended. My friends and I were at a shop on Mount St. Michel, and by this time we began adapting to cultural changes and communication barriers. We were looking to all buy t-shirts, but we were uncertain on how to ask the woman for our sizes. We were in a bit more confident at this point and much less anxious, and as we initiated the conversation, the woman recognized our language barriers and appreciated our efforts in trying our best to communicate in what we thought was her language. Had we not been overcoming our culture shock, attempting this conversation would have been much more difficult and probably wouldn't have resulted the same. The woman we were trying to communicate with, who we thought was French, much to our surprise, responded in perfect English, but with a British accent. She then went on to express how much she appreciated our efforts, and she also said that we were much more respectful to the French culture than most of the tourists she encountered. She continued the conversation with sharing her story of moving to France and how she experienced the same culture shock that we did. After hearing how I have overcome culture shock, let's talk about how you can manage to cope and overcome culture shock as well if you ever decide to immerse yourself into a foreign environment. There are many ways to overcome and cope with culture shock, and it will most likely make immersing yourself into a new culture much easier. One thing the book recommends in chapter 3 is to not be so hard on yourself and that it's okay not to adapt as quickly and as easily as you expected. It also expresses that homesickness is normal and it is natural to feel a push and pull between something new and exciting and the environment you're familiar with and comfortable with. With this push and pull, be ready for progress as well as setbacks. And finally, it is important to reach out to others. Communication can be a challenge when you're learning how to operate in new cultures, but it can also be a solution. To conclude today's speech, we talked about what culture shock is, my experience with culture shock, and how becoming more confident and overcoming it benefited me. And finally, we discussed some techniques to overcome culture shock if you ever put yourself in that situation. When immersing yourself into a new culture, you never know what can come out of a hello, and overcoming culture shock is the first step to new experiences.